Steve Orsini. Steve, sit kind of here. Steve is the Deputy Minister of Finance and the Secretary of the Treasury Board in Ontario. Before that, he was the Deputy Minister of Revenue. I've worked with Steve on the Jobs and Prosperity Council in Ontario and a number of federal, provincial things, and he really does, frankly, get the innovation issue. And in fact, if we're going to drive Ontario in terms of more jobs, more productivity, more growth, I think Steve is one of the leaders that understands it's going to come through the innovation side. John Knubley is the Deputy Minister of Industry Canada in Ottawa, which is not just responsible for our sector branches and a lot of our innovation policy, but also the granting councils and a number of the other organizations that deal with science, technology, and innovation. John is responsible for. Before running Industry Canada, he was also our Deputy Minister of Agriculture, our Deputy Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, and spent some time in my favorite province in the country, Nova Scotia. Next to him is Ian Klugman. Ian needs no introduction and actually will not get another one. It was supposed to be Kunal Gupta, but almost in the spirit of the previous panel when people talked about sports, Kunal, as a good entrepreneur, was actually exercising too much and has thrown his back out and actually couldn't make it here today. So Ian's going to stand in as I think, a pretty good representative of the private sector and what it takes to make that move between kind of university education, private markets, and the role of government. And last but not least, in any way, shape, or form, is Michael Horgan, who is the Deputy Minister of Finance in Ottawa. Mike has just announced his retirement. So after 36 years, Mike, he is going to retire on April the 18th from the Public Service of Canada. Before Finance, Mike was also our Deputy Minister of the Environment. He was also our Deputy Minister of Indian Northern Affairs and our Deputy Minister for the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency. So he has been, and again, I think all our three Deputy Ministers and Ian all get innovation. Having been around government for many, many years, these are kind of three of our leaders on the government side and Ian on the private side. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's your panel, and it really is a chance to talk about kind of this interface. My opening comment would be that I think we're going through a paradigm shift in competitiveness. And in countries like Canada, where we're relatively high cost and relatively low scale, the only way we're going to be competitive is by being innovative. Well, there's no other solution. We cannot be a low-cost, kind of low-scale producer. It doesn't exist for us. So if we don't make innovation kind of synonymous with our competitiveness, we're not going to succeed. And that's an easy paradigm to say, and it's a very difficult paradigm to execute. And part of seeing the success stories early on was seeing kind of what it takes to get there, and part of that's what we'll talk about kind of here. The challenge for Canada is that we have some extraordinary innovators, and we have some great entrepreneurs, but they're still the exception, not the rule. And how do we make kind of them the rule, the expectation? How do we make entrepreneurs the expectation? I mean, Waterloo, and again, this region is unique. Farron and I hosted the president of Technion University here, and Waterloo has just done a fantastic partnership, and they very much have the same expectation we do, is to be, and they are an innovation leader. The statistic that struck me, I think we're equally good in our ability to do research and all that. The difference that Farron and I both took away from it is we were talking about our graduating class, and 43% of the graduating class of Technion, their first job is in a startup. And that's their preferred first job. And there's nowhere in Canada where that number and that quantity, that's where we should be. And this is probably the only university and the only region where we actually have the potential to get there. And so there are other examples, and in many ways nobody would pick Haifa as the startup kind of nation in the world either. So the ability to build is not God-given. It actually can be created. And I think a fair bit of that is what we'll talk about here. The challenge, though, is Canada, while it's got great innovators, is not an innovation nation, and it's not yet a nation of innovators. And so how do we kind of take kind of our incredible examples and actually make them kind of what everybody should think about as they go through education in Canada? So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit here. I mean, the first question I'm going to throw out to folks is, in a panel on the role of government innovation, what do you think the role of government is in innovation? There's some views on government as kind of less is more. Other views that just get taxes down and other things, that'll do it. Other views that this is more of a partnership or collaboration. So what is the role of government in trying to generate that innovation economy we talked about? And also, what's the responsibility of the private sector if you think it's a partnership model? Steve, start with you.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today and at University of Waterloo, a hub of innovation, so it's quite exciting for me to be here. I would list a number of key things. One is to support, government plays a major role in supporting knowledge creation. Well, it's early learning. It's getting our educational system into the next type of learning where you focus not only facts, figures, but character building. Our post-secondary education system to support the innovation clusters, the incubation that come out of those institutions. I'd also think in terms of government policy that would support that as well. Whether it's competition policy, trade policy to keep the country open, accessible, to tackle new markets, but also in terms of supporting firms, whether it's trade missions, and supporting that part of the environment. So it's not government trying to solve it. It's not government trying to do it. It's government facilitating that type of innovation. And it's a cultural thing. It's things that we have to do in every part of government, whether it's access to capital on the regulatory front, or whether it's supporting Communitech and the work it's doing as a network and a facilitator of innovation. But it's not doing it for the private sector firms. We need the innovators themselves to innovate.
Great, thank you. John.
So again, great to be here. Wonderful to be in the environment of Waterloo and the tremendous cluster of activities that are here. In terms of the role of government, I just say I truly believe that government is about being a partner, a collaborator, and a creator of an environment for success. And perhaps that last role I just dwell on the most, which is to say, I think, and I'm sure Mike will elaborate on this, creating the right macroeconomic conditions for success for companies is the starting point of the framework. At Industry Canada, we spend a lot of time thinking about science, technology, and innovation, and we're in fact developing a new 5-year plan, if you like, for the Government of Canada. And similar to what Steve said, we really have 3 elements we focus on. One is the knowledge base and creating the environment for research. The second is the people, promoting the high qualified personnel across the country to be able to do the kind of innovation required, whether it's at university or in business. And then lastly, innovation and entrepreneurship, and promoting innovation and entrepreneurship. And we really do this with 2 types of tools. One are indirect and tend to be the tax side, and the other is direct and more direct programming. And I'll end by just saying I think one of the big issues, and Tom Jenkins, as I see is sitting over to my left, he raised it in his report on innovation. One of the big things we focused on in thinking about the innovation ecosystem for Canada is what is the right balance, if you like, between the direct programming the government provides versus the indirect. And if you look at the last 3 budgets really, and the implementation of Tom's report, we spent a lot of time trying to really change that balance and put more emphasis on direct programming and ensuring that businesses are pulling the innovation as opposed to government working with on the supply side to provide ideas. We really think the weakness in Canada is that need for business to pull the research into the marketplace.
Okay. I'm going to jump over to Mike and then give Mike.
Thank you, and let me as well say that it's a great pleasure to be here this morning. It's a really important topic, so I'm pleased to be part of this panel. I'll come to what I think government can do, but I want to start off a little bit about what is the fundamental problem here. And I don't think the fundamental problem in Canada is the supply of innovation necessarily. I think it has actually more to do with the demand for innovation in Canada. And demand has to do with individual firms on a sectoral basis and with the structure of our economy. There are a lot of firms doing research and development and innovation in Canada. I'm sure there's a lot of them in this room. that are doing research and development and doing a lot of innovation. But it's not at the right scale in Canada. A little bit of potted economic history. You know, I think Canada's gone through a very long period of time where we've had excess supply of labor in Canada as the baby boom bulge kind of moved through, the demographic. That meant that labor was pretty cheap in Canada, relatively speaking, and firms then didn't have to be capital intensive to actually make a fairly good profit. We also had a very long period of time when our exchange rate was undervalued in Canada. The IMF would have estimates of how much it was undervalued, but it was undervalued for a very, very long period of time. And firms, therefore, didn't really have to be all that competitive to take advantage of a very low exchange rate environment. As a result, and in the last 15 years, we've had one of the very fastest growth in real per capita income in the OECD in Canada. Where did that come from? Well, we had a lot of people working in Canada, so they were earning income, and we had very positive terms of trade effects. There were a lot of demand for Canadian commodities, and so we got rich, or richer, over the past 15 years because we had a lot of people working and people wanted our products. What's going to happen in the future? Well, we now know that we're one of the fastest aging populations in the OECD, and we're not going to be able to rely on very high employment anymore as a source of income. And in terms of trade, well, who knows? I mean, sure, there may be demand for our products going into the future, but you can see changes in, for example, natural gas markets that have really changed the structure, so it's unpredictable. There are other structural features of the Canadian economy that have played against us, I think, on the innovation side and R&D side. We're less concentrated in R&D intensive industries than many other countries. We have a high percentage of our firms in Canada that are small firms. And those small firms have a hard time reaching the kind of economies of scale that they need to do really good R&D. Our business leaders in Canada, I'm sure not no one in this room, but if you compare Canada versus the United States, the level of educational attainment of our business class in Canada is much lower than that in the United States. And that may say something then about their willingness to take risks and to adopt new technologies. We're an economic province of the United States, and so, part of the US supply chain. And we have very highly regulated industries in Canada, from banking, transportation, telecom, culture. We have marketing boards in the agriculture sector. All of this is changing. Our population's aging. We are going to have a relatively high exchange rate. And so the whole kind of tectonic plates of the Canadian economy are changing. And that's going to be very important, therefore, for us to pay attention actually to our productivity performance going forward, because the traditional sources of income growth are unsure in Canada. What can governments do? Well, I think governments can help on the supply side of innovation. We have to have a first-class education system, whether that's preschool, K-12, and post-secondary education. Governments can support fundamental research in universities and other places, like the Perimeter Institute. It can do its own research. Governments can also help on the demand side, and so that the firms who want to do research and want to be innovative can be supported by government, whether that be through the tax system, through direct programs, through support for venture capital, support for accelerators and incubators, protecting R&D through our patent system, and supporting tech transfer from universities and colleges into the private sector. I think, though, the number one issue and the thing that is really going to drive innovation in the future is competition, and that is the key to innovative success. And we need more competition in Canada, not less.
Thanks, Michael. Ian, you're an intermediary between
Yeah,
everything.
It's great to follow Michael Horgan at any given time. I was still reeling from what he said, and he's covered sort of the full landscape. I think a couple of things. One of which is I do believe that we have the opportunity of being the next innovation nation, of the next startup nation. That crown that Israel holds is within our grasp, and I believe that for a couple of reasons. One of which is, we do have and have made the right investments in R&D and education in this country. We produce, we do some of world-leading research in this country, and we produce graduates which are comparable with anyone in the world. We look at Google, 3 biggest universities they recruit from are MIT, Stanford, and University of Waterloo. And so we've got the right ingredients. We've got the right kind of inputs to the equation. The second thing is we do have a rising entrepreneurial class. It is becoming the new black to do a startup or to work for a startup. And so I think that we can set our sights on that 40% number and really trying to attain that. The third thing I think is really that we have the privileged access to the largest market in the world. And yes, there are high growth markets which are growing faster, but the U.S. economy is still $17 trillion, 4 times larger than any others. So we've got this sort of privileged access, which actually is also the envy of the world, for the record, to this incredible market. And so we have to say, okay, so what are the gaps then in us being able to realize this vision of being the next startup nation? And that's where I think it turns to the role of government. I think it's a couple of things. I think it's infrastructure in the form of these kinds of investments. But the approach necessary is not to build things that we need or don't need, but really to bring that competitive focus and lens to what we do. This notion of competitiveness will drive innovation here when we realize the fact that we're not competing with people in Manitoba or Nova Scotia. We're competing with people all over the world. And when you bring that lens to apply not just to the firm at the firm level, but to the jurisdictional level, then we start to say, okay, what is it that we need to do to ensure that we are competitive with any other jurisdiction in the world? And that's when we can bring almost an entrepreneurial or innovation lens to what we do. That's where we can say, we don't have the kind of risk capital. We need to have a major investment, and of course, government launched the VCAP program to try and do exactly that. So what are the gaps that are in place that are getting in the way of us achieving this vision? What are the ingredients necessary? So as opposed to trying to, sort of solve this sort of from a macro perspective or government Canada-wide, to say, let's pick the battle we want to win, and what does it take for the role of the private sector and the public sector in achieving that objective?
Okay, thanks. Now I'm going to ask, put up your hands, all those in the room that are entrepreneurs. How many entrepreneurs do we have here? That's great. So 30%, 35%. How many professors from the university? Great. And I think you shouldn't necessarily exclude yourselves from being entrepreneurs either, actually. I think the vision is it should be one and the same. So kind of we've got to focus, innovation is really focused on 2 different corporate sets. One, it's more innovation in our established firms. That's not what we're really talking about at this summit. We're talking much more about innovation through startups. How do we actually generate more startups in Canada? And indeed, most of the employment growth in Canada is going to have to come through startups. It's not, we're going to, for the productivity reasons that kind of all the folks kind of mentioned, we're not going to have. But just to give you 2 statistics, Canada now ranks, so in the private sector in Canada, we rank 22nd in the OECD in private sector spending in R&D. 22nd, right? Behind Slovenia, Iceland, even Ireland, Mike. That's not where we have to be as a country to actually get to where we want to go. And if you look at the World Economic Forum on their innovation ranking, we're now 25th, lower still. And it's on a combination of metrics and other things. So my question back is, everybody from government said, innovation is crucial. But given the statistics and given the pace at which our competitors are moving that thing, what do we have to do more of more quickly? How do we actually take the getting innovation and actually moving it up to the speed and the scale that's actually going to change our metrics? John, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. I mean, just to reiterate, I think Canada is blessed and challenged by an innovation paradox. And there's a book on this topic, of course, from the Council of Canadian Academies. On the one hand, we're very strong in terms of our research and our longer-term works, very strong in terms of the public good support that we have provided in government to that research side. Where we're not so good is on the innovation side and getting commercial results from the basic research through the innovation pipeline or ecosystem to the marketplace. And that's where we are really challenged, and the OECD statistic that you pointed out is a demonstration of that. I think what do we need to do? I think one of the challenges in Canada is, and we see it in the programming that I administer, is we tend to try and sprinkle it all over the place. And I think we need to be bold and focus on the companies that are successful and have real opportunities to go global and to succeed in the world of today. And on the other end, we need to be realistic that some of our companies are going to fail and are not well placed. So I think the challenge for Canadians, and I think it's almost part of our culture, is we tend to want to be in the middle, at the average, and not focused on excellence and being globally successful.
Steve?
Just picking up on some of the points raised, I think it comes down to the culture and overarching desire to be less complacent and less entitled. If you look at the entrepreneurs that were here earlier today, they're hungry, ambitious, driven. That's the culture that has to permeate from low school to post-secondary education. And so a couple of things that government is doing, coming from the work that you did with the Jobs and Prosperity Council, is to send entrepreneurs into high schools. So they have greater exposure to the innovation aspects of starting up their own firm. So drive that earlier in their thinking when they're starting to map out a career. One of the things that we did in the 2013 budget was put money aside for youth, part of the youth job strategy. We know the unemployment rate for youth is double what the average unemployment rate is for people in the province. But rather than just employment subsidies, create an innovation fund and an entrepreneurship fund that will help fund incubations at universities, loans, grants to get startups. So I think sometimes we focus too much on the old industries and some of the big companies, and I think there's an awakening at the policy level in government to really start focusing on the startups, because they will be the jobs of the future. When I saw the panel of entrepreneurs, I think we're in pretty good hands.
Mike?
Yeah, I mean, you know, you ask yourself the fundamental question about why do we believe that Canadian individuals and Canadian firms are less capable than others to do R&D and to be innovative? And you know, my fundamental answer to that fundamental question is I don't believe that. But it's very easy to be complacent in a country like Canada. And I think, you know, for a large part of our business sector, they're only going to do that if they really feel that they have to. And the only way they're going to feel that they have to is if they are subject to a lot more competition than they are. And we are moving into a global economy that is going to be very highly competitive. And I think that in terms of things that government can do to enhance competition, if you will, in the Canadian economy is to do things like greater free trade agreements, which this government has certainly been doing, and greater deregulation and greater opening up of the Canadian economy to competition. And it's then that entrepreneurs, because I believe they will respond to the competitive forces that are taking place in Canada. Now that doesn't mean that there aren't some things that governments can do, are doing, and should continue to do. You know, you talk about infrastructure, for example. I think that's really important. Low taxes, I think, is a good thing. Support for R&D and fundamentally having a very strong education system, I think, are important. But it really comes down to the hunger of Canadian business writ large and a desire to be competitive for them to be driven to do R&D and to be innovative.
We missed because of your travel, but if you heard the panel early this morning, one is, do they ever feel they're in a global competitive market, and do they ever feel the pressure, and they're doing really well, so it picks it up. Now we've got a question on the board, Ian, so why don't you kind of both catch it and do this, is how do you see kind of government kind of helping startups, focus more on the startup side, and where do you kind of see the leverage for more? And the question that was up, a Twitter question was, where can government help outside things like Communitech and Velocity? So you've got vehicles like that. Do we expand them? Are there other ways of helping startups directly?
You know, The answer is yes. I mean, I think a lot of it is not necessarily the big programs, which are important, solving those inputs necessary to start and grow great companies. A lot of it is really bringing an entrepreneurial lens to everything that we do. I mean, you know, every jurisdiction on earth has got a small business policy framework, but how many have got an entrepreneurial policy framework? How many of them are looking at it and saying, not only what are the necessary incentives to start and grow companies, but are there disincentives built in that are hindering or skewing people to behave in a certain way? And I mean, I think, you know, one perfect example is, you know, the investment that goes into research. You know, if we were to say take $1,000 for every student in science and math and engineering and say to them, we're going to give you $1,000 for your third or fourth year design project, you know, what would that generate? I mean, how would that tip the scales in favor of hitting that 40% of startup output of the university system across the country? Are there disincentives into things like SHRED, where there's ceilings on when it moves from becoming a refundable tax credit to not being a refundable tax credit? And so it's not just looking at the necessary policy framework and saying, what are the incentives to growth, but what are any sort of built-in systemic disincentives to growth?
And I love the kind of saying at kind of one conference, a person talking about innovation noted that the Stone Age didn't end because they ran out of rocks. And that's the other part of competition, which is your competitor today is not probably someone you know, but it's someone whose plan is to disrupt your business, and disruption is going to come through innovation. And we either can be the disruptors or be disrupted, but the status quo is not really a model that's terribly viable for the long term. And so I think, as Michael was saying, part of the danger is that the status quo has a strong hold, and yet it's probably the least viable long-term model to look at. Okay, a couple of questions to go back more directly on. Folks have raised the issue of taxation, and Tom in his report looked at this as well. Canada brags about having amongst the best tax supports for innovation in the world. And yet we have some of the worst private sector performance in the world. Are we too far along the tax versus direct or community or sectoral support? Kind of Tom worried about this in his report and thought looking at some rebalancing is possibly the way to go. Federal government has looked at it and talked. But kind of, you know, if I'm a potential startup here in Waterloo, how should I look at that? How does that matter to me? How does that balance kind of help me versus an established firm? Mike? Where would you be there?
Well, I mean, we have moved in the direction that Tom suggested of less support through the tax system and more through direct program spending. You know, it's always controversial, though, because, you know, we spend $3.5 billion on the SHRED program. So it's the biggest program effectively supporting research and development in Canada, biggest single program. So every time you say, well, I'm going to reduce the tax incentive and I'm going to redirect the money over here, then you get screams from people who have benefited from the tax incentive and may not benefit from the direct programming. And so it's been a difficult move and transition. But I think in general, you know, we should have both. And should we move perhaps somewhat more in the direction of direct program spending? I think probably we should, but that always means very targeted programming. And you know, to the extent that the SHRED program is a bureaucratic program to access your tax credits, direct programs are also going to be very bureaucratic in a world of very high accountability in government for spending. And so there's always going to be issues, I think, with moving on the direct program spending route as well.
Steve, you hold the tax levers as well.
So there's really two issues. Do you incent activity or you reward success? So a lot of our tax credits are refundable, so you get it whether you're successful or not. And we are currently having a panel looking at all our business support programs, especially on the tax side, to see are we getting the best bang for the buck. The other thing is sometimes you're incenting one part of the innovation chain, SHRED, R&D, but innovation goes along the continuum. If we incent too much on one end of the continuum, we might be missing big opportunities. And we're a bit concerned that some of the things that we perform very poorly on is software. So if you look at some of the research in terms of machinery equipment investment, we're behind the US. We're behind the US on R&D, as we've talked about. We're also underinvesting on a per worker basis on the software side. Not on the hardware side per se, but on the software side. Maybe we're directing too much energy in one part of the innovation chain, and we should challenge how we're supporting business investment. But I will go back to Michael's point that open markets, free trade, greater competition, and changing the culture from entitlement to being more hungry are going to be part of the cultural change required.
Great. Let me there's a question up, and obviously Susan had an impact, because the question is, how can we get women's voices out there more for government supportive innovation? I'd almost broaden it to, how do we get younger people's voices out there? Because in many ways, it's younger folks that are demonstrably the most successful in startups. And indeed, if you don't start when you're younger, and younger Canadians aren't necessarily playing in the policy debate to the extent that I think they should. So I think the question's a great one. I'm just going to generalize it a little bit. John, start with you.
Well, I think one of the roles of the government is a convening role. And events like this today, for example, are ones that government should be participating in and even promoting. And part of the objective for the government in this context is to give voice to the startups and to the young entrepreneurs, male and female, in terms of what they're doing, so that we really understand not just in the entrepreneur world what is happening, but all the players in the ecosystem are hearing these voices.
Ian?
I think, again, I think there's a lot of these challenges, really could be addressed through the role of intermediary organizations such as ourselves. Whether it's, how do we support not just startups, but the intersection between startups and large companies. And certainly from our perspective, we have seen, and in large part to Tom Jenkins, is, we started doing some work with Canadian Tire, and then of course I got calls from Magna and CIBC and Manulife Financial and Loblaws, and the list goes on and on and on, because they're all struggling with the innovation challenge, and they all think that, if we can find a way to talk to and do business with startups, then we can bring a lot of innovation in. I also think that this issue around getting more young people involved is something that has to come from the community. I know Tom and I are on this sort of crusade to say to young entrepreneurs who are 23, 24 years old that when you have an opportunity to talk to a policymaker, when you're asked to participate in a roundtable or do a dinner with a policymaker, whether it's public servant or whether it's a politician, you say yes. If you're asked to serve, you say yes, because you have a role to play. They don't understand what's happening on the ground. They don't have the kind of perspective you have with your business, and they need your help. And if you're going to want to, have a better policy framework, then you need to contribute to it. And I think that what happens is that, there's sort of the early adopters, there's the ones we lean on a regular basis, and then all of a sudden it becomes normal course for people to be part of those conversations. And they do. It takes a bit of time, but they do start to see the value of it as it's not just, as it's understanding government as well as government understanding them, as it is in being able to develop better policy.
Mike or Steve? Again, I think, larger business, government is complex, and what I worry about in Canada sometimes is we have silos. We have universities, we have government, we have the private sector, but in many ways the startups are almost another area as well, because they're not in established business. They have different needs, they have different ambitions, they have different time frames and what have you. And finding a way, I think, to understand better how to deal with that rather than necessarily kind of, homogeneous or average policy, I think is an interesting one if we really believe the job growth and a lot of our competitiveness will come from startups. So any thought, Steve, and then Mike?
Just very quickly in terms of bringing a more inclusive approach to anything we do. Certainly women play an important role, and the Ontario Securities Commission is now looking at developing a policy on women on boards. So this is the governance model of corporations operating in Ontario. But inclusiveness also is youth. So the Minister of Finance for Ontario has youth on his economic advisory board, entrepreneurs, to get a fresh look and perspective on our government policies affecting startups. But it's more than that. It's a diverse of the people who are disabled, providing advice to a panel that the Minister of Economic Development and Trade and Employment has established to make sure that we have more inclusive workplace. I think that diversity and inclusiveness actually makes us stronger.
Michael?
Yeah, well, I'm actually a big fan of incubators and accelerators, where you have young people who are actually working with people who have some experience and who can mentor them. And I think we learn a lot by paying attention to what people like you are saying about what young people are saying, if I could put it that way. I mean,
So you have to do more, Ian.
well, I mean, and we're in the process actually of a new program of supporting incubators and accelerators in a much more robust way at the federal level than we have in the past. I think if I look as well just across the board, I think we have to do a better job of linking some of the kind of technical skills that people are learning in high school or in colleges or universities and business skills that people are going to need. So I think there's going to be a lot more attention has to be paid on sort of the entrepreneurial and managerial aspects of research and development and innovation in Canada. And the more that we can think about those linkages, the more we'll also be bringing in young people into the dialogue.
Let me turn to a number
Can I
of...
just
Sorry,
add,
sure.
I mean, I think another element of this is on the direct programming side, we're really spending a lot of more time trying to develop programs which are linking our collaborations and partnerships. And the Quantum Institute and Mars are examples of that. And what we're trying to do is again, link the basic research through the pipeline to the marketplace and get businesses to pull the research to the marketplace. A concrete example of this is the Business-Led Centers of Excellence program. It's a peer-reviewed program, but the basic idea is to, again, link the business community and the business interests with the longer-term research. And I think in this direct programming area, and then Tom has put emphasis on how we need to do more of this, this is really the big issue. How do you get business to recognize what it needs from the basic research community? And there's a valley of death in the middle there somewhere where I think we're always struggling to find answers and make those connections and get results and money in the marketplace.
So, part of the conference, a fair number of panels have been on venture capital and both the challenges in Canada about, why we haven't had a more vibrant, robust, and successful venture capital industry. The federal government announced about a year and a half back a new program. The details were announced,
400 million.
in the fall. Fairly recently, part of it was an incubator, and Ontario's doing some of it as well. So, folks have had a chance to kind of hear from the venture capitalists during the courses. How about you folks? How do you, from kind of government or, again, in your kind of intermediary role, how do you see the venture capital playing into the success or lack thereof of the startup, building the startup nation that we want to have, and kind of where the focus has been given, where it should be given, how we get federal and provincial alignment on this, and the incubators, Mike, you raised it versus in combination with the overall capital. So, huge part of the conference. We've heard from the VCs directly. Let's hear from the government as part of this. Michael?
Yeah, well, I think venture capital is definitely part of the answer to the problem. It's not the only. It's not the overall solution to the problem, I don't think. So it's a piece of the puzzle, I guess, is what I'm saying. What we're doing at the federal level is working with provinces, Ontario being one, to recapitalize some existing venture capital funds. We also want to put some significant investments in new funds of funds, and we're putting federal money into that, and some provinces are putting money in, but we're also getting private sector participants in. And then there's a third element of, increasing our support for incubators and accelerators. So there's a fairly robust venture capital action plan, if I could put it that way. The question I ask myself, though, is, if you go one step further down the chain, is there a sufficient ability to aggregate beyond sort of initial startups and in Canada? My observation is that there are a lot of startups in Canada doing very innovative things, and then once they get to a certain size, they get bought out by somebody else because somebody in the United States wants that technology or wants that innovation or wants those ideas. And somehow it's a little bit beyond kind of the startup venture capital. I think we continue to have will continue to have a problem there, and I think it's probably useful to do some thinking about that. I don't have the answer to that question, but I think that's going to be an important problem.
I do.
Ian.
I have the answer for that question. This
Double
just
Communitech.
No, I mean, I think it's interesting question. So one of the things that people tend to forget about Waterloo Region, people look at it and they say, amazing rate of startup activity here and great startups coming out of here, and thank God, so many of the entrepreneurs are saying, you know what, I'm going to stay here and build my business, as opposed to what traditionally was the case, which is I'm going to pack up the minivan and drive to Palo Alto. And so, lots of really exciting things happening there. I think the other thing that people tend to forget about Waterloo Region is that it's also a place where people have thought about big ideas. I mean, it's still the home of the largest tech company in the country, largest software company, largest e-learning company, largest digital image company, largest satellite company. So we're not just good at starting companies, we're good at growing companies here. And I think a lot of it is going to be a numbers game. So, if we look at last year, we had 500 net new companies going through our intake process. We look back 10 years, there were 6. So, at some point, it is always a numbers game. We know if we look at the numbers, it takes about 1,000 startups to build one big company. And there's no shortcutting that. I mean, you have to have 1,000. A bunch of them are going to get taken out along the way. But if you've got influencers like, people like Tom Jenkins, more recently people like John Baker, Desire to Learn, and even Michael Led and Stephen Lake, is they're saying, think big about your ideas. Yes, some crazy check's going to come along. You don't have to take it. If you do take it, that's okay too. But I think a lot of it is about modeling the way. A lot of it is these role models. And people will see others who don't take the big check and work towards building something bigger. And I think that's something that's going to be driven, I think, by the entrepreneurial community. It's in the same way, we had the great Own the Podium campaign, which, challenged us to go for the gold as opposed to the bronze. But it also, government played a significant role in that by backing the athletes and producing great product that we could take to the market, quote unquote, the Olympic Games. And we saw the results of it. And I think that we're starting to build that Own the Podium type of mentality among the technology industry here in Canada, or certainly in Waterloo, and increasingly across the country.
Great comments. John?
2 points. I think Waterloo has a lot to offer to the country. When you actually look at the numbers for Canada, there is a huge challenge for Canada in terms of developing, moving beyond the startups to create high growth firms. The numbers show that, and I hear a lot of issues around this when I go across the country and talk to businesses. And the numbers, again, in comparison to the United States, show that we're great at creating small firms, but we're not so good at creating medium and larger firms. The issue of complacency may play a role here in the culture, and comparing Silicon Valley to Waterloo is maybe part of that. But there are big issues here, and I think this is one of the big challenges for Canada. We really need to be bolder, more competitive, and be willing to drive for excellence to create these medium-sized and larger firms. Second point is just a smaller perspective from me, which is along with the $400 million for venture capital from the government, along with, I think, $60 million for incubators, $100 million has also gone to the Business Development Bank to help those companies that are coming out of the incubators. So that's another element of the programming that we put in place.
I think the high growth firms also is a function of the venture capital. And I think that, you know, we've really struggled with building an industry here. A lot of our failure in the past, because a lot of people, you know, especially the institutional investors, look at it and poo-poo it, and they say, well, you haven't had the returns, it's not a viable asset class, and blah, blah, blah. And a lot of it was the timing at which our venture capital industry was launched, and the kind of the market that was available for companies to invest in. I think at this point in time in history, it's absolutely a blue ocean strategy for VC in Canada. I would love to be a VC in Canada right now because we've got, you know, massive supply of great companies to invest in, and we've got a very small demand. And so I think the best thing that can happen is, you know, do everything we can to make, you know, the Venture Capital Action Plan money out there as quickly as possible, because I think it's going to spur the development of many, many, many funds across the country. And where high growth firms play in all of this is that there's lots of, you know, we're really good at bootstrapping because we've had to be in the past. And that's great. We build companies that have a higher 5-year survival rate. But the problem is we don't have the opportunity of going after those big market opportunities where the high growth opportunities are. And I think that venture capital will play a role more so than really sort of in any other aspect of the equation in those high growth opportunities. Certainly not going to solve it, but.
Stephen?
I think, building on the comments so far, we need a comprehensive approach, from microloan supporting through the various programs to, you know, the venture capital, working in partnership with the federal government. We recently announced a significant venture capital fund in Ontario, building on that. We also have written the OSC, Ontario Securities Commission, to ask them to look at crowdfunding and exempt markets for business associates, family members, and they're out consulting now. And so they're out there looking, do we have the right regulatory structure for crowdfunding, for example? So that's an important consultation piece I wanted to flag. The other one is more advanced financing from financial institutions playing a bigger role. And that, I think they could continue to evolve and become more of an important financing vehicle for growing businesses. And also pools of capital. So we have, 26 universities in Ontario, 29 pension plans with their own assets. And what we're trying to do is encourage them to pool their capital so that there'll be larger capital pools that will have different asset classes, will allow them to expand into venture capital. We need to take a comprehensive approach because we just don't want to move the bottleneck just down the line.
But I mean, the challenge, you know, leave aside kind of Waterloo, look at, you know, City of Toronto. It's the third largest expenditure of research dollars on medical research in North America. And yet, it wouldn't be in the top 15 in terms of commercializing that, turning that into jobs and kind of firms and kind of wealth. So it's, you know, how do we actually turn the, you know, the research strengths that we've built institution by institution over the last 15 years and actually get that into the market? How do we've talked about parts of the chain, you've talked about a holistic one. How do we actually draw it right from either the students or the IP and university right to market? Is there something, is there a gap, or do we just have challenges all along the food chain? Ian, you're nodding.
I mean, I think we have to stop thinking about research as being an end product. I think research is an input to wealth creation. You know, I can't remember what the quote you said last night, but it made perfect sense about money goes into great research, and the job is to turn research into making money. And so I think that it's thinking, it really is truly thinking about research as being an ingredient to growing the economy as opposed to an end in and of itself. It's kind of like the same thing with a startup when they go out and they raise a bunch of capital. You know, smart startups like Thalmic didn't have a party when they raised $14 million. They said, you know what, it's not success yet. That's an input to us having a chance at success. And I think that's the same thing. And I think that the focus is just, it's a different approach. Instead of thinking about, okay, how do we take that research, it's more about, we know that a successful catalyst will be backing the entrepreneur, and so how do we back the entrepreneur? Because they're the ones who are the right economic actor in the equation who can translate the things that are happening on campus into successful inventions or innovations.
Other thoughts along, Steve? How do we ramp up the
So
Ontario engine?
when you compare business R&D investment, we rank pretty poorly. When you look at government-sponsored R&D, we're among the best.
Yeah.
And it's that commercializing, I think, we're hearing we're not doing as well. And that is where we need to look at all the approaches we're taking. Are we linking the business problem to a solution that might be in a university setting? Again, referring to the report that Kevin was involved in, a lot of greater linkages between university or research and business, acumen and marketing. We need to do a better job linking the two, and there's some ideas that we're working with from that report that hopefully will bring those two together more effectively.
Just coming back to culture and comes back to entrepreneurship. John?
Well, I mentioned earlier, I think we are trying to experiment with our programming to really build these collaborations and partnerships, which move across from research to the market. Mars is an example, but I mentioned to you, Kevin, earlier, and I'll now mention to you, I was last week at the Center of Excellence for Research and Commercialization for Regenerative Medicine. So there's lots of strengths in terms of stem cell theory in Toronto, and this particular organization is trying to link those strengths directly to the business community and startups related to that. And they are working to do that in a partnership and collaborative way. Now, the challenge here is this is not easy to do, and the evidence around outcomes is mixed, but I believe that this is the way to go for the future. It's these collaborations where you're really linking research to market and market to research and searching for results, and in a global context. It has to be from a global leadership perspective.
When we pick up the global and go to one of the questions, and it follows from a panel and a talk that Tom gave yesterday, which is the importance of branding for your success as either a startup or a startup that wants to become a kind of mid-sized company. And the question is, what do you see as a role of government, either provincial, federally, or jointly, in helping to establish the brand for Canadian startups abroad? Since everybody has agreed that you can't just have a Canadian market mindset, you have to have a global market mindset. What's the role of government in helping build that Canada brand outside of Canada? Do you want to be the brand meister?
Yeah, well, one, I think because of our federal structure, and this is no criticism either of the federal government or of the provinces, but we tend to not cooperate with each other on this, whereas I think, no one really is going to understand the Prince Edward Island brand, but they'll understand Canada brand. And, with respect, I think that's true as well, of Ontario, that, we have to brand Canada, and we're going to have, it's perhaps a kind of contentious thing to say in a country like Canada, where we are a federation. But, I think that's the key thing, and I think we should use the tools that we have available. We have a trade commissioner service that I think is very active, and we should actually be doing more with our trade commissioners, not less. We should be doing more with our universities as they go around the world. Instead of just branding themselves, we should be branding Canada as a kind of place, a destination for high quality students and high quality research. So I think we have to think more about branding Canada and just not sort of fractionating our efforts in the country, which we tend to do.
Steve?
I think there's a lot of prospects for branding Canada, even in a provincial context. We know there's a growing middle class in Asia, and we know Canada has a very good brand, and we talk about baby food, which is one of our growing exports to China, because the quality and the safety image that Canada has in terms of public health, public safety. So that's one of the things that we can leverage more and more of. Knowing Ontario, this area, is a beacon for innovative information technology is another important brand. So I think the fact that it's Canada or different aspects of the province or Canada as a whole, we should not be ashamed in using that to capture new markets.
John?
Well, I believe strongly, as Mike said, that it's really important that we demonstrate a Canadian brand. We take advantage of the Trade Commissioner service that's in place. I think it's our job on the government side to give opportunity to all of you, whether you're in the startup community or you're someone like Tom Jenkins, to help you participate in markets across the world and to demonstrate Canada's advantages.
But I'll turn to Ian last, but certainly as Tom knows and Ian, if you're in Beijing, Sao Paulo, there's 125 countries there and hundreds of thousands of firms. So if you're a startup from Waterloo, that's a pretty noisy marketplace. And how we help them through a collective brand is an interesting one. I think there is a bit of a difference on a brand for startups versus perhaps a more established one. That again, it's a little bit of a differentiation theme for startups to come up. But nobody brands better than Ian. So what do you see?
Well, I think that we need to set aside a little bit of our Canadianness. As Mike Kirkup was saying today, we've got to stop asking for permission. Brands are meant to be aspirational. They have to be grounded in truth, but they should be aspirational. And I think that we need to be much bolder about what we feel about our regions, our provinces, and our countries. I think it's a combination of both. I mean, we spend a lot of time branding Waterloo Region, and that's our primary objective because we know that it helps attract talent and capital to this community. But it also gives our startups an unfair advantage over other communities as far as being a competitive street address. So if you're a startup and you're in Palo Alto, California, instant credibility because the street address gives you credibility. If you're a startup in Topeka, Idaho, probably not so much. And so we see brand as being, again, a launching pad and a way for our startups to differentiate themselves. At the end of the day, it's going to be about the companies. And what we have to do is we have to trumpet our companies. We need to do a much better job at cheering for our home team. And that means, the companies that are coming out of here, we all should be using, wearing, and promoting. We really have to do a much better job at cheering for our own home team.
Michael, sorry.
Jump in on one issue, which is, I think sometimes it's hard to go abroad and sell your ideas if you can't sell them at home or close to home. And I think that in some cases is a real problem. And I think we have to do a little bit more thinking about, are there things that can be done so that companies, when they do go abroad, are going to have, their sales, their first sales, and substantial sales here in Canada. Because people, if you go to China, they're going to say, "Well, you can't sell in Canada. Why are you coming over here?" And there may be things. I have to be careful here. I might have to bite my tongue as Deputy Minister of Finance, but there are probably more things that we can do on the procurement side as a government of Canada. And we've done some experimenting on this, and I think our plan is to do more. The reason why I bite my tongue is it also can't be an excuse for just wasting taxpayers' money, in a time of parsimony. But I think, if you look at the United States, I mean, it's such a huge military-industrial complex down there. It's, you have the DARPA program, so it's easy for firms to kind of just tap into just this massive government procurement program, which is called national defense in the United States. We don't have that here. So I think we have to think a little bit broader. It's not just a defense issue, but a government procurement issue, both at the federal and provincial level, I think.
Well, I was going to, Michael, raise that because it came up at our Jobs and Prosperity Council about, could you have some sort of strategic innovation procurement? Tom Jenkins and I were at a Ditchley conference, and we were quite struck by how some of the Scandinavian countries use innovation procurement as a way to, in a sense, have proof of concept and new things. We don't do that for very Canadian reasons about process and fairness, what have you. I've always been struck that we seem to cite the U.S., but I think the U.S. is much more willing to procure strategically if they want to than we have here. Any thoughts along John and Steve from the?
Just a couple points. As Mike will know, we have experimented again with Public Works and what's called the Build in Canada Innovation Program. And I think the general sense is this has been very successful. And the program is designed, again, to identify innovation in Canada and to fund them using our procurement requirements in the Government of Canada. And then I am working a great deal as Deputy of Industry with the Deputy Minister of Defense and Deputy Minister of Public Works around military procurement. And the government has announced a new approach where we will put much more emphasis earlier on the interests of Canadian business and how they fit and align with the needs of the Defense Department. So we are working on this procurement side of things, and it's very much part of the agenda.
Steve, Ontario.
We're looking a lot at supply chain management in terms of our procurement within the healthcare sector, the educational sector, the government as a whole. And part of that is to lower costs, but also get greater, higher value-added activities from those supplying government. And I think that's an area that we probably haven't pushed to its utter limits, but one that I know the business community, whether it's the auto sector or aerospace sector, are doing because they want their suppliers to be leading-edge, innovative firms to improve their downstream products.
Okay, we'll wrap up, but in 30 seconds each, if you were Prime Minister or Premier for the day, what's the one thing that you would do kind of new or differently that actually would convince folks that will make a difference on the startup and innovation challenge in Canada? Premier Orsini.
Thank you for that promotion. I would say that innovation has to be a cultural embedded attitude and approach. And I'd start in school, in the elementary school, and make it part of the curriculum, make it expose kids earlier into that way of life as opposed to ones that they're exposed to in terms of their parents, or most of their guidance counselor came from a university setting, not an entrepreneurship setting. So I think it's important to expose kids earlier into the world of innovation.
I would put more emphasis on these collaborations where we're trying to draw from the global research excellence that Canada has to find success in the marketplace. I'd pick 3 areas, and I'd put more money into supporting those connections. It's not just about money, it's also about longer-term focus. But I'll give examples. Say we'll do quantum physics as at Waterloo. We'll do stem cell theory and regenerative medicine in Toronto, and we'll do lightweight materials in Montreal.
You can either be a Premier or a Prime Minister.
Oh gosh, that's a tough choice. I mean, I think the one thing is we've got to start looking at we've got to take some. I think it's almost time for a new national dream. I mean, I think it's time for us to make some bold statements about what we want to achieve. You know, we want to be the next entrepreneurial nation and have the book written about us as opposed to Israel. Then let's do that. And I think we've got to start looking for new solutions. We see, for example, a lot of big companies globally and startups from sort of almost day one turning into new models for bringing innovation and research into their organizations. And it's things like challenges. It's about activating the crowd. It's about hackathons. We had NASA up here and in Toronto simultaneously over the weekend doing a space hardware hack. And you know, they're turning these types of solutions, and we see, you know, government starting to experiment with some of these things through the open data type of challenges. I think we need some new tools in our tool belt because a lot of the old ones aren't working anymore.
Michael, last word, as
Well,
always.
Steve actually basically said what I was going to say first, but since he said it, I'll say something else then. I would, and this is more a long-term thing, I would seriously look at increasing competition in the Canadian economy, whether that's through reducing trade barriers or through deregulation of some key sectors in the Canadian economy. Because my belief
Can we applaud?
that the only way that startups will benefit is if there are other hungry companies in Canada that are feeling competitive pressures, and they're going to need these startups. And so that wouldn't be a short-term thing, and it's a very complicated thing to do, but that's what I would do.
And I'll offer one. We've had Dominic Barton, who's a very proud Canadian, but he's also the global head of McKinsey. In fact, some of the McKinsey research was cited yesterday. And probably nobody travels to more countries and has more sessions like this around the world. And at a couple of events that we've had, Dominic, his fundamental observation and answer to a question like this is, we have to be more ambitious. We, as Canadians, we are just not ambitious enough. We actually look over borders and wish we had other people's assets, and we don't realize the extraordinary assets we have here at home. So his, I think, 30-second response is, you know, the solution is ourselves, and we have to be prouder about what we have and more ambitious about how we use it. Can I, on behalf of everybody, thank the panel very much for a very stimulating discussion.